associates.
Ready? Okay. All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to the January 22nd, 2025 Cottonwood Heights City Planning Commission work session. We have a quorum. We have everyone. We have a quorum. And we'll first start with reviewing the business session agenda. We have two items. We have a business item, and then we have the consent agenda. And I'll go ahead and we can start with the business item.
Yeah, I'll take us through just a little bit of kind of slideshow view of what's in the staff report for your consideration. Let's see, are we good on everything? Okay, awesome. I'll share my screen here. For a little bit of context for audience and commission. What I'm sharing here is just kind of what are the things we look at during the technical review of a project? What are the different parameters we're looking at as staff? So I'll cover that, and then there will be time for questions, of course, if you guys have them. I will also note we have the applicant here tonight, so when we get into the business session, as always, you know, it's their project. They'll be able to add clarification to the areas you guys have questions on. Okay, let's see. It'll probably just take a minute to catch up. Sometimes there's a lag. Tonight's project has two application numbers. I'll talk a little bit about why that is, but this is for CUP 24019 and SUP 24008, excuse me. The project name is Brighton Lofts. So a little bit of context on this. You can see to the right an aerial image of the property. It's right on the corner of Bengal and Oak Shadow Circle. And the exact address is 3425 East Bengal Boulevard. They are requesting two different actions tonight. So that's where those two application numbers come from. They're requesting a conditional use permit and preliminary subdivision plat approval. The applicant is Nathan Anderson. We are recommending approval as staff, but with conditions added. And the zoning is neighborhood commercial, which is a very relevant factor of our analysis. The acreage is just under half an acre at 0.48. This is just a broader vicinity map that shows where the property is in relation to more areas in the city. So you can see it's just across the street from the Smith's Shopping Center on Bengal. It's on the far eastern end of Bengal, almost to Wasatch Boulevard, right next to an LDS Ward House. You might recognize it more from the building that's currently there. If you've driven past, I'm sure you have. A Wells Fargo bank was here for many, many years. So this was here from, it looks like about 2006 to just recently. The building is still standing, but that branch has closed. So the location is closed, property went up for sale. There's some context on the site. This is a screenshot of our zoning map. So again, you can see the subject property toward the top left of the screen there. It is zoned neighborhood commercial, so that's the pink color on our zoning map. You'll see it's the same zoning as the Smith's parcel across the street. And then surrounding it are primarily three different types of residential zoning. So those each have a different kind of gold beige color to them. Now let's talk about what's being proposed. So the subject proposal is a live work townhome development. Again, there are two different parts of this proposal. So the conditional use permit part is required because live work developments are conditional uses in the underlying zone. So they are allowed, but they are conditional uses. That's why we have that coming before the commission tonight. And then the subdivision part is required because anytime you are dividing property into separately owned units, as is being proposed tonight, you have to do a subdivision. Because it is 10 separate units, it goes to planning commission. 10 or more comes to planning commission for subdivisions. So there's some context on why we have two application numbers and sort of why the code requires this. This is a screenshot that was included in the packet. It is technically the landscaping plan, but shows a little bit more of the site layout. It's a little easier to see than just a black and white site plan. So that's why we put it in. You can see my cursor will kind of track here with a little bit of a lag. You've got 5 units on either side, and then you have a central drive aisle coming up the middle, a little bit of parking in the back, landscaping surrounding. And we'll talk more about the site development standards, but that's a snapshot of what's being proposed site-wise. So the first thing we look at when a proposal comes to staff is what's the proposed use. So again, they're proposing a live work townhome development. First question is this allowed in the underlying zone? Yes, the live work developments are allowed in the underlying neighborhood commercial zone. Again, they are allowed as conditional uses. What is a live work development? So our code lists it as an allowed use. It doesn't provide a definition, which is frustrating. In most communities, a live work development tends to be a development that has a residential component and a non-residential component, and then the local regulations provide more clarity on what that breakdown is. In the absence of a local definition in our code, we defer per code to a resource called the Planner's Dictionary. This dictionary has various definitions for live work development. 2 of them include these. I'm going to read them just because the text is so small that it might be hard to see. So the first one that it offers is A dwelling unit combining residential use types with commercial or limited industrial use types. This use classification includes, but is not limited to, office, live work facilities, or other similar uses. A different definition offered in that resource is a dwelling unit used for both dwelling purposes and any non-residential use permitted in the zoning district in which the unit is located, provided that not more than 2 persons who do not reside in the unit are employed on the premises. So those are some comparable definitions, but again, our code does not have one for Cottonwood Heights, so that is a little bit tricky. What is the applicant proposing in terms of live work in this proposal? So they are proposing that the live component is the townhomes, obviously, and the work component is the ground floor office space that is to be used by the tenants of those units. Natural next question is, does that combination of things comply? So in the absence of a local definition that specifically says it needs to be this and this, that proposed combination of dwelling area plus ground floor office space for use by tenants has been found to be compliant with code in this project and in past projects that have set some precedent. So I would just add my note here that if stricter parameters are desired for this use, the city should consider a code update to add those. But as we know today, we do not have those in our code.
Sam, really quick.
Yeah.
Is it possible for them to develop this without a live work component under the current code?
I don't believe so. I was not in the pre-application meeting, but I don't believe that was discussed as a viable option.
No, so the 2 comparable definition or allowed uses are live work or mixed residential housing, which is another mixed use development type.
So could we deed restrict that there is a commercial component there for us to at least make sure ground level is used commercially?
I don't believe so because this definition has found to be compliant with our code based on past projects. So I do believe that what they're proposing meets it. I don't think you can restrict a use that is allowed, but Mike can.
For previous live work projects, we don't mandate that there's a business in there 24/7, 365. It doesn't require an active license at all times, but it does allow for the flexibility for that space to be licensed commercially and not be subject to only the home office standards that we have in every residential zone. So it's a tool that provides flexibility. It allows for commercial use. It doesn't mandate that it has to be there all the time.
So what would be the difference between just a pure residential and this use if nothing is mandated and
A commercial license can be issued for it, whereas in a residential zone, a commercial license cannot be issued.
But again, that's kind of where this comes up of maybe that's something the city wants to look at adding into the code to more activate those ground floor spaces to require that they're done a different way. That's not what the code says today.
Another question.
Yeah.
On the other side, is there any restriction on what commercial use can be carried out in that unit?
Absent the recommended conditions and the narrative, it would be whatever uses are allowed in the underlying zoning district.
So in this underlying zone,
It's neighborhood commercial. It's a wide range of uses. However, there is a relevant recommended condition of approval.
So we did recommend in this situation where what they're proposing of office space that's for the tenants has found to be compliant with the code. We did recommend that it be limited to such to minimize parking impact on the surrounding properties. That's a condition the commission can decide if they like or not, but that was a recommendation we made.
how do they park the office currently?
So we'll get into that.
Okay.
That is covered in later slides, but that was a parking requirement in our analysis. So
Perfect.
Just a question on that.
of course,
Could that be enforced? Suppose they put a business in there that only has 1 employee,
Mhm.
but then requires that people come there for some reason. Parking's gonna be a horrible problem.
Yeah, and that is something that's always looked at during the business licensure check. And then of course it's subject to enforcement. Sometimes we will have businesses who say one thing on their application to our business license department, and then in actuality, they're operating outside of that. That position who does business licensing works very closely with code enforcement when there are those issues that come up.
How are our parking requirements different for this?
Yeah,
license?
let's get into that on the parking slide.
Okay. So if you can cover that, and then also, I'm really curious, as I drove it last night, just the elevations from the southwest corner to the northeast corner are pretty substantial, and so I'm very interested in where we're gonna be at grade wise, just looking at
Sure.
the impact of the adjacent properties. And then I also, if you can address anything that you have about the fact that the neighbor to the north is definitely less than 8 feet, potentially less than 6 feet. And if we know any history for, there in terms of a variance or however that worked, that appears to be very, very
So
close.
you mean the neighbor to the north,
To the
their
north.
home is 6 feet from the property?
Uh-huh.
I don't have any information on that.
Okay, well, just and any implications, even just the commentary that you would have on that.
Yeah, when we talk about setbacks, we can talk about all that, but let's get there
Okay.
when we get there.
Yep, you got And then just on, as far as these definitions, are we, because of how we've stated in the code, are we, when we refer to the planner's dictionary for whatever is not defined, are we then bound by the planner's dictionary from a legal standpoint?
Using that definition, when
Which
one
one,
is
one or
absent,
two or both?
the director has the authority to choose a reasonable definition.
Okay.
What I do is look at one that doesn't have incredibly specific standards for like square footages and things like that. That's a little arbitrary to apply a definition from, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and say, this is the definition. It requires all these limitations. So we look at the reasonable ones. Number one there is what I conclude is a reasonable definition of live work based on what's being proposed, based on other projects that have been approved and defined as live work.
And then how much does precedent factor into that? Because we've done this at least once in the
I think
last
it's
4 years.
The other two projects that have live work units are in the mixed use zone. However, they are classified as live work units. So that use type has been established and built and approved. And, I think that is some level of precedent. How much I can't say.
And then adjacent municipalities, is there any other precedent in terms of how others in our vicinity are handling this issue?
Probably. I don't know.
Okay, I'd be curious if
Each
they're doing
code is going to
differently.
define and regulate uses differently. So I'm not sure.
I have one more question. In regards to the workspace,
Mhm.
it cannot be living space, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, just, I think that's
Yeah.
an important, it can't turn into an additional bedroom or.
It cannot. Correct. I mean, people break laws all the time.
No, I mean
By
that,
definition, no.
right.
Okay, great. Let's talk a little bit about density. So that's another big topic that always comes up. What's the density? What's allowed? So what they're proposing is 10 units on just under a half acre, 0.48. Natural question, what's the allowed density in the zone? Short answer, there isn't a specific number. Another interesting facet of our code. So some zoning ordinances for Cottonwood Heights zones, context, each zone has a different zoning ordinance. Some of those will list an actual number where it'll say this many units per an acre is what allowed. So for example, mixed use zone says 35 units per an acre, that's your maximum. The general plan also specifies a density number for the residential zones. So we do have some numbers for certain areas. Though both of those documents discuss the intention for the neighborhood commercial zone, neither specify a specific number of this calculation is allowed in the neighborhood commercial zone. So there is not a strict density figure. In the absence of that, the city uses the other development parameters to assess whether the project's compliant. So that's when we're looking at the other elements like setbacks, building height, parking, et cetera, to say what can fit by code, et cetera. But yeah, there's not one listed, and that is confusing. So let's talk about what some of those are. Setbacks and height. I've taken the applicant's site plan and then just in blue tried to make it a little brighter for the screen with what these measurements are. So that has my little text box added there. But the south property line, so against Bengal Boulevard, is what's considered the front on this property. That's required to be 25 feet. They're proposing 25 feet. The west side, so that would be against Oak Shadow Circle, has to be 25. They're proposing 25. The east side, over here, next to the church, only has to be 10 feet. They're proposing 10. And then the rear side, which is the north, in this case, has to be 25. They're providing just over that at about 28. So the plans do show that the setbacks are compliant with the code.
So in regards, a question just for everyone, so.
Yeah, of course.
For comparison,
Of course.
what are setback requirements? I mean, I know what they are, but I, just so everyone understands the setback requirements for like the R1A, the R, you know, the
Sure.
typical residential, what are those for comparison
Yeah, so if
purposes?
this were an R18 lot, which is the most common residential zone in the city, and I don't do building permit review anymore, so people can correct me on this, but 25 front. Rear would be 20. Side adjacent to a public right of way, so Oak Shadow Circle would be 20. And then you would have 8 on the interior side. Was that,
That's correct.
am I?
So these are quite similar to that.
These are all, except for the front, which is the same, every other setback is greater than what a typical residential.
I mean, it's like not a direct comparison because it is multiple units on the
Sure.
lot, so.
Right.
But if we're just looking at the parameter of setback, yes, it is a little bit larger. in this zone.
What is residential multifamily setbacks?
I would have to pull the R28 ones. I don't know those off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think that'd be most relevant as far as adjacent properties to.
Yeah, we
residential
can-
multifamily.
We can pull them right up.
I believe they're slightly less than R1.
They are, they're a little bit less than R18.
Cumulative sides are, that goes down to a 5-foot side setback. I think the front and the rear are similar.
We can pull it and read it verbatim, but they are a little bit, R28 setbacks are a little bit less than R18.
And then what is residential multifamily's density requirement per acre while you're looking that up?
Well, R28 is 2 units per 8,000 square feet. Residential multifamily is a convoluted equation based on dwelling units and the amount of acreage you have. It's not a standard blank units per acre. It's dependent on your property size.
The mixed use one's definitely the most straightforward at 35 per acre. But yeah, we can read any of this verbatim. I mean, that's what this session. is for.
R2A, front yard is 25, a 5-foot interior side, 20-foot corner side, 20-foot rear.
There's a car on the plaza currently,
Oh, gosh.
so.
You know, roundabouts are difficult to navigate.
Well, I mean, are they?
You know,
I mean, it looks.
Double roundabout here.
It's fine, right?
Our
Well, that's.
handicap accessibility is so inviting.
There was no collision,
Vehicle.
Thank
right?
goodness.
No one saw a crash.
All works.
No.
Okay, as long as everyone's safe.
I think
I'm like, oh man.
To peek in on, see what we're.
right up.
And I was like, what's going on behind me? And I did not expect there to be a car right there. Oh my God. Okay, was there anything else you wanted to read from that? Chapter.
That was the question, so.
The
Yeah.
ingress egress with the vehicles and the fire issue, anything that you can address in terms of the requirements of the code, because this obviously will be a private road going in.
So the fire department approved the project,
Okay,
so they had no preliminary comments. They'll have to do another review if it moves forward, like but they didn't have during the preliminary review any denial. It was approval
It was
with
approved.
conditions.
Are they requiring sprinkling on this?
They would have to answer that. I'm not sure if that's required by their code. The applicant may know from their build process, but I can't speak to fire code unfortunately. Okay, talk about height. Okay, so maximum height measurement in feet is 35 feet. They're proposing 30, so they are underneath that. I think asking the applicant your questions about proposed grading would be great. I have their grading plan we can look at.
Great.
But it may be in the business session most helpful and illustrative to ask them. I mean, that is measured from existing grade. We know
yes.
that that's the case, so unless you anticipate this being a different situation.
It's all measured from existing grade.
Mhm.
So that's a 30-foot measurement. It's taken at the existing corners of each of those buildings. So there's 2 structures on site. So we take the existing grade measurement at the top northern corners, the bottom southern corners of each building.
So any fill would count against that. But yeah, I think they could talk more about their grading.
Yeah,
plans.
there's a substantial north to south and
Yeah.
from east to west.
Right,
Just from that northeast corner down to that southwest corner, and some of it's just the natural slope of Bengal Boulevard, but just
yeah,
where that effectively ends. When we talk about that 30-foot proposed, I'd also be curious what the current height of the Wells Fargo building, the structure is, just anticipating the questions that we'll get from Oak Shadow residents.
sure, yeah, I think we're glad the applicants here can
Great.
provide additional resource there. Okay, let's talk about lighting and landscaping. So, as you guys know, a lot of times when projects come, we say, what about outdoor lighting? And then I say, oh, well, it's an existing building, the lighting's grandfathered in or it's vested. So, bright and shiny lighting ordinance does apply to this one because it's a new build. So, It needs to meet our outdoor lighting ordinance in full. The photometric they submitted complies with everything except for two, so they do need to correct that. And we can have a dialogue with their lighting engineer on sort of like making that happen. But the total site lumens were too high, and then the illumination at the property boundary was too high. The illumination 5 feet past the property line, so the light trespass was low enough to meet our code, but right at the property line, it was a little too bright. So that has to be fixed during any permit. We recommended a condition that just reiterates that. So you saw that in your packet.
Sam, for the public, can you point out that when you're east of Wasatch Boulevard and how we've graded it?
Sure, yeah. So if this project were east of Wasatch, they would have even a lower illumination maximum. It would have to be even dimmer. But because this project is west of Wasatch, it's the standard that is put in code.
But not quite dark skies, but
There are a
very,
lot of,
very aggressive.
yeah, a
compared to
lot
the
of
rest of the
elements
city.
of that ordinance, which are a dark sky ordinance. Especially with the fixture types that are required for any lumens over 500. So kudos to the planners who worked on that. I can take zero credit, but I think it's a great ordinance. And then on landscaping, the proposal does comply with the landscaping standards. I think it's notable that some of the landscaping specifications in the zone don't apply to the project because of the property size. It is under a certain size. And because of the proposed use being residential primarily. So that is, I think, important to mention. Okay, fencing. This is another big one. These are all big topics. So it's a little hard to see in this rendering. It might be a little easier behind me. The applicant's proposing some 4-foot fencing around the private yard areas for each unit, but they're not proposing new site fencing. So let's talk about that. Their plans do indicate that they would keep the east side block retaining wall and chain link fence. So that's the side next to the LDS Ford house. And the north side block retaining wall and wood fence. And they can talk, the applicant can answer any questions about that intention to keep that in the business session. But talking about, okay, what would be required here? Site fencing is not required, but I do think it's an area where we've seen reasonable conditions added by the commission for enhanced buffering between properties. So that's something you guys may want to discuss tonight, is do we want to require additional site fencing? There is currently a fence, from what I can see in photos, on the side next to Oak Shadow Circle. So that may be something that the commission feels like, yeah, you know, that needs to be there to provide some buffering, maybe further discourage parking on that cul-de-sac. I think that's a great area for the commission to chat about.
On that east side, it's covered with ivy on the internal side,
Okay,
which will likely be completely shaded by these buildings. So I understand the block retaining wall. That may be the easy way out. So I'll look forward to the applicant explaining.
yeah,
And also what the applicant's interaction has been with that property owner.
of course.
And if not, that will be a concern for me.
Yeah, I think fencing is one of those areas that can have a great, you know, can be an important improvement for the property and for neighbors. And I think that's a great area for you guys to chat about as far as conditions go. Okay, parking, the big one. I have 2 slides on parking because it's such a big topic. So little refresher, the city uses what's called the ITE parking generation manual for its parking requirements. This is another kind of frustrating thing because guess what? This manual you can't read unless you have access to it. So I will say, open invite. If anyone ever wants to know a parking requirement, email staff, we will look it up for you, but it is very hard to access. Our code via also the ITE does not specify parking requirements for visitor parking. So we'll talk a bit more about this, but it does not have specific visitor parking requirements. As such, the parking minimums were established by looking at 2 parts. We're looking at the dwelling units and we're looking at the office space. So the dwelling units, by this engineering manual that we use, require 13 stalls. They're providing 20 through those 2 car garages. The office space requires 3. They are providing 4, and we can pull up a site plan to look at what that is. It's the surface parking at the north side of the site.
What calculation are you guys using for 3 stalls for?
Yep, so in the staff report, we can pull the ratio right here. The ratio generated by the ITE, I'll just scroll to it, I've got the packet pulled up, is 2.84 stalls per 1,000 square feet. So at just over 1,000 square feet of office total, that hold at 3 stalls.
So in that circumstance, just kind of continuing to that, in that circumstance, if every single one of those units has one employee, where are they parking?
So that's why we recommended a condition of approval that employees be limited just to the tenants of those units. Because we thought that would be,
Residents only.
yeah, we thought it would be a negative impact potentially on properties if there were additional employees trying to park there.
But he also said earlier in what we read, that there could be a maximum of 2 employees amongst.
And that
all
was,
those.
that was one of the definitions from the planner's dictionary.
Yeah,
Just as an example of what's in that planner's dictionary. But that's what I said, that the definition that me as the director thought was reasonable to apply to live work did not include that specific language.
I have another question. As I look at the Brighton Lofts construction plans, if you look at the entrance to the garage, they aren't very wide.
Yeah.
And as you drive straight into the side that has the stairs on it, those stairs impinge upon that space. I'm really wondering if you can actually get 2 cars in that garage. At each garage, the
Sure.
way that that's drawn, there are no measurements in there, but I'm just looking at it.
Yeah, great question. That's not something that our engineering department flagged in their first review. It could be something they flag in the technical review. I will say if during the technical review process, something gets flagged that conflicts with what's approved, but potentially at planning commission, applicant would have to come back for a revised approval.
Well, if that's the case, they become one car garages. And
I think that's a very
that's a
reasonable
huge
question.
problem.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question.
And the other thing I'd have is suppose somebody has a pickup.
Yeah,
Pickup's not gonna fit in any of those.
No,
Where are they gonna park the pickup?
I definitely have similar questions to you. What I'm gonna limit my commentary on is what does the code require? And then we can definitely ask more. of
They're
the
not
applicant.
tandem stalls, which are prohibited. They may be narrow, but they are 2-car garages.
What size car?
Well, I mean,
Seriously.
there's cars that are gonna outsize any garage out there. I mean, we don't regulate for the biggest trucks on the road.
Oh, I
2
get
in every
that,
garage.
but you gotta be reasonable in my mind. If that garage is so narrow that you can't reason with a stairway involved in that, if you reasonably can't put cars in there, then you've got a 1-car garage and you've got 4 guest parking stalls that could be utilized for those folks that have 2 cars. And that's gonna become a real parking
The
problem.
garages are 21 by 21. A standard commercial parking stall is 9 by 18.
Okay,
So that's two parking stalls in a surface parking lot.
okay, I'm just curious.
I do
So I'm
think
just-
I haven't any measurements here, so I'm just guessing.
Parking questions are so important. I think it's great you guys are talking about it,
Yeah.
because
So-
that's a big part of it.
Yeah, back to the ratio here. So 2.84 stalls for 1,000 square feet. What is the 1,000 square feet that's referenced here? Because I would imagine that each of those office spaces is 500 square feet.
So each of them is 108 square feet.
Oh, really?
So that's where the total 1080 comes from,
And that actually meets qualification for live work is 108 feet.
in the absence of any local regulations, yes.
It's an office.
But again, a very valid point of, is that what the city wants for live work on a long-term basis? But we
Yeah.
do not have a metric in our code that says to qualify as the workspace, it has to be this minimum size.
And I would imagine that the intent of this code is to actually be live work, and it seems like this project's almost pushing to be non-compliant with the code and create illegal, non-conforming situations.
I think that is a sentiment we saw echoed in some public comments as well. I'm just gonna say what our code does and doesn't say.
This matches what was approved on Fort Union Boulevard as live work.
I will say, you may have read it in the staff report, it has been talked about multiple times that the definition of live work needs to be brought up. This was discussed in the form-based code because we had similar feedback and staff concern during the last time this came up. Nothing has ever been adopted to change it to date, but I think it's just relevant to note that
Yeah.
if this is a concern for the commission and others, maybe that's something the city wants to look at again. And it's this constant tension between what does the code say now and what do we want it to say maybe in a future update.
So even right now, if we were to look at this from, like, if we want compliance of live work here, what type of levers do we have to allow or create compliance? Because I don't want to approve a live work and there's not any live work happening.
Sure, yeah.
I think promoting the neighborhood commercial is to promote live work developments, not multifamily developments that, they just slipped through the code because
I think again,
Possible.
that's a sentiment echoed in a lot of public comments. So I think there are shared views there.
So can
I'll
we
let-
deed restrict
I'll let
or
Mike
live
discuss
work
that.
and deed restrict that you have to
If you
apply
feel
for?
that without that, there's a potential negative impact created by what we've confirmed is an allowed use in this zone. Conditionally, you can impose conditions to mitigate that impact. You have to tie a requirement to deed restrict to some perceived negative impact.
I
And if you
think,
can do that with valid findings, and that's the most reasonable condition that the commission can come up with, then yes, that's within your
I
purview.
think one thing we looked at in kind of wondering that, I will just add to your consideration is, would that in turn create different negative impact of parking if you have more commercial activity there? So it's,
Well, I mean, I think the zoning promotes commercial activity, so I think we need to park appropriately for that. That these are live works and not just, residential multifamily.
I think that there's some very fair feedback there. I will again say it's been found to meet current code. So,
So I think we need to dig in pretty strongly on this, just because if every single property owner does use this legally, that would then create a negative impact parking wise if there was commercial components here. So are we approving or reviewing a multifamily project, or are we reviewing a live work project? Because what we have to look at is every single person is going to have a commercial use here.
Yes.
So with that, are we parking it appropriately? Is it meeting those needs? And we need to make sure that the safety component's going to be in place on that, but also, we don't want to promote non-compliance and,
If I would recommend, if you are concerned about parking and the parking burden, even with the condition that the only user of the business is the tenant that lives in the unit. And with the fact that these are 100 square foot office spaces, then you would need to ask probably for some more data to justify asking for more parking. So they could go survey other live work products, they could go survey other projects and say, what's the average parking burden by the business use there? Bring that back and that could help you inform any condition you wanted to impose to ask for more parking.
yeah,
As it stands, our analysis looked at our parking manual. We already combined two uses within that ITE, both residential and office, using the metrics that we use to review any office use, and said, okay, you're based on this analysis, total office square footage, here's how much extra parking is needed.
yeah.
Two thoughts. The first is related to this live work idea.
Yeah.
I think it's important to know that as a residential, straight up residential use, what's being proposed here is permitted. You can have an office in your home. So the use that's being proposed here would be permitted under straight up residential. There's another motivation for live work units that's not related to the commercial space. So it's a means to get to another motivation for the people. I mean, I've done this rodeo one other time and that was my experience there.
Sure.
Secondly, I think there might be a place here where I would differ with the way you've defined, if you flip back a slide.
Oh yeah, let me go. Do you want to go back to the packet with those
No.
ratios?
The
Where I had the ratios pulled up?
required parking. So you're evaluating the minimum requirements as if it was all one office.
Yeah.
In this case, it's 10 offices. And I don't think you would evaluate it that way if it was 10 commercial offices. I think you'd say,
Sure.
I have 10 individual offices. I have to have at least a parking spot per office.
Definitely see your point.
So it's odd that you use a definition that combines all the space as if it were one.
I will say, it is not me doing that, it's the
Not-
manual.
For sure.
Well, what I wonder is, does the manual actually do that? Because it seems like a tortured way to think of it, that
There is so much about that manual that can be described as tortured.
An example is the office development on Highland Drive. It's only 2 offices. That's 2 separate buildings on one property. The parking was based on the cumulative office space in both buildings. They drew an arbitrary property line through it and then they have cross parking agreements, but they each property doesn't have enough parking on its own until you combine the two properties into one. So we have done that before, not on a 10 small office basis, but on 2 office buildings, we have done that.
I see your point though. I think there are things where it's like, well, this makes sense, you know, logically, I would want it to be this. And then there's, what does this adopted manual say? And there's tension between those two. So I appreciate the commentary on it. I think this is all really helpful. Are you guys going to talk a little bit about the traffic study? I've got more slides on parking, so.
I think we're stalling out because they're very, very, very small parking spaces to begin with. I mean, just if you account for garage doors, getting, you know, probably 50% or more of the vehicles in there is improbable if you're gonna get 2 vehicles in there. And then the ingress egress to get vehicles going past each other is gonna be tight. And then the additional, the visitor parking, it's not one factor to me. It's like the fact that it feels like everything's being maxed out.
Sure,
And if there was any give on any one of those, I think I would be less concerned, but it just
it can be
feels like
hard.
we're going for as tight as we possibly can.
It can be
on
hard
every
when that
measure.
happens, and it can also be true that sometimes there is property right to do that, and that is really tough. It's really difficult, and I think you guys do have a hard job in reviewing these things, so I do appreciate that.
The, just for comparisons, the live work units on Fort Union. I know visitor parking came up in that deliberation. The one by the fire station is 12 units. Has about 5 visitor parking stalls outside of the garage space. The other one,
Those are live work as well. I can't remember that.
Yes.
And the other ones
Same-
definitely
it's
are.
The same model, so the same thing
Same
of,
thing.
the same debate happened then, that was the first planning commission meeting I ever went to.
the other one is 24 units, so it has some more guest parking, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, maybe
And that's
total, or 24
23.
units.
23.
What's the zoning for those ones?
Mixed use,
Same.
So that's mixed use, and this one's
Different.
explicit neighborhood commercial.
correct.
So I think emphasis on commercial, and I think that, you know, with that, we're gonna be promoting that, and I think we wanna make sure that we're not promoting non-compliance.
The only reason I compare that, the zoning's different, the use category is the same, it's live work in both cases.
Just to make sure we cover everything, I think let's continue on the parking. We can talk as much as you guys want. And of course, we'll have time for the public to share as well in the business session at 6. A little bit about the traffic study. So I am not a traffic engineer, as I will remind everybody. But our engineering department did review the traffic study that was submitted. They provided a traffic study when they submitted the project. The engineering department reviewed it in their preliminary review. That traffic study found a level of service C is maintained post-development. That's an acceptable level to the engineering department. So I wanted to add that note. They did require that during any technical review process that follows a planning commission approval, again, that's theoretical, that's hypothetical, but when projects do get approved by the planning commission, they then go through technical review. The traffic study does need to be updated to verify the on-site parking spaces as kind of another layer of verification of saying with this site context, does that parking work? So that may be of interest to your conversation. And also to add the ADA compliance. Right now, that's not specified, and that is an important part.
Is the level of service today C as well? So it doesn't change the level of
It
service.
doesn't change the level of service. I think level of service is a tricky thing because of course things change when things do develop. That's not to say nothing changes. It is to say, by the standard of traffic engineering, that level of service is maintained. So that's kind of I find that to be a little bit of a confusing term, but. And then I'll just note again, then we'll come to you, Commissioner Olson. If, let's say they do a traffic study and it does impact what let's say they get approved. They do a traffic study, a revision to their traffic study during technical review. It revises what was approved. They would have to come back for that revised approval. So just kind of an iterative process if that does change, but Commissioner?
I'm curious of the 4 visitor parking spaces that we have there, are any of them ADA compliant?
They aren't showing, I don't think they're showing ADA right now. I know that when engineering looks at ADA standards, they're looking at a certain type of pathway that would get from a stall to an entrance of the building. I think they're looking at dimensions. So that was something they did say needed to be specified in more detail. I don't know everything they're looking at when they look at that, but I think we could also ask the applicant if that's something their engineer has added in or not.
And clarifying that just as the physical therapy nerd in the room. If these are 10 independent businesses and we're going to call these individual businesses, my understanding is that each of those businesses should have an ADA compliant stall.
Again, I don't want to overspeak for not being
Agreed.
the one reviewing it. My understanding is that the ADA requirements are triggered by how many total stalls there are in the parking lot. And it's like one per a certain number. But obviously we can verify that.
And it's obviously a different standard when you're talking about businesses versus residents, so.
Yeah, and I don't know that our code differentiates. I believe it's based off the total number, but of course. we
Yeah, and it's a
wanna
building
verify.
code standard as well.
Yeah, some of these are. And I know we haven't done a deep dive and I don't know that today's the day, but this is,
Can be the day.
we. Aspirationally, we can do a whole lot better in this city about making things that are newly built accessible for those with less ability. And
Yeah.
when we put things this tight, I'm just gonna say it, like, if it's gonna be a business, that's different to me than whether it's residential. And if I'm a quad with a electric wheelchair, I should be able to get in there and do business with any one of these 10 businesses.
Sure.
And that's, that's not just us as Cottonwood Heights.
Yeah, and it's so hard also with existing infrastructure, like that's a whole other tangent, but man, when we're looking at making changes to existing stuff in the city, it can be startling how much has changed since that was built, so.
And so because it's new, it's a different standard. So that's partially why I'm like, I just want to make sure
It is,
as
and
we do the
it's,
technical review
for
that
sure,
we address that.
for sure.
Building code mandates it. They are standards, whether they're enough of a standard or not, that can be debated, but there is ADA accessibility building code that's taken very seriously and flagged by the building department before any permits ever issued.
So what I'm seeing here, it looks like there's 1 to 25 spaces, 1 accessible ADA spaces.
That's what I was recalling as well, yeah. That's. the
But
ratio.
that's for if we're treating these as 10 independent businesses,
I don't think it
that,
varies, unfortunately. I don't think that ratio varies.
So I think a lot of ways that we can look at this is an office condo, and I think that's how we would want to look at it, as an office condo building in one way, fashion, or form. So I think we need to abide by that, which an office condo is going to have certain amounts of parking ratio requirements for that total building. I think that's the way that the staff is looking at it. There's a lot of ambiguity in that space here, but 10 individual office condos operating, we need to make sure that parking is there. If they're using parking in the garages for guests, or if they're using it externally, there's going to be negative impact on the neighborhood on this, I would imagine.
That's a perfect segue into the next topic about parking, which is visitor parking. So we've talked about how the code doesn't call out visitor parking as a specific requirement, and how that in actuality is like, well, we know there will be visitors. And so one thing we looked at in our staff review is we are concerned that visitors would try to park on Oak Shadow Circle just because of the convenience. So well, first of all, a little bit about that. It is a public right of way, so public parking is allowed by default, but we do feel like, given that this cul-de-sac is a single point of ingress and egress, relatively narrow, it's relatively short, we have concern that an excess of parking would create a disproportionate negative impact on those homes. So we have recommended a condition of approval that townhome visitors not be allowed to park on that cul-de-sac. Signage would need to be installed at the developer's expense at the entrance to their development and the cul-de-sac that specifies this. I also will mention here, I didn't put this in the slide, but I think fencing is another relevant item there, where if you do require maybe a fence on that side, that might also discourage some like quick access between the two. So that's where that condition came from, was kind of worrying just a little bit about the impact there.
I'd like to add too, as
course.
a condition for that signage, is that it should just say an overall statement that no parking for Brighton Lofts, not visitor.
Oh,
not
sure,
it should just be general.
that may be more clear.
I think you're pushing your luck there, though. I think you either have to say no parking or parking. But no parking impacts the people who live there too.
Yeah,
I mean, you're gonna put a sign up, it'll come down. I know this because it's happened down here too.
sure.
That sign has no real impact. So this condition is just a nuisance upfront, but it doesn't really change anything.
Yeah, if there are other ways you guys feel like would be different conditions you could use to mitigate that, I think by all means discuss that. This was kind of what we proposed as staff as a starting point.
Well, it may be easier to just say no parking overnight. I mean, I think on that property on the other side, it's likely they will, whether intended or not, people will park in that church parking lot,
Mm,
which I'm imagining, as I observe, the church has been pretty quiet about that unless it's overnight parking, and then it becomes a
Interesting.
problem. So, and
sure.
I'm imagining that, similarly, I mean, if it's no overnight parking, it does mean that there could be overflow during the day, but it would limit the ability for current residents who are sleeping there, that you can't park in the cul-de-sac, you can't park in the church parking lot overnight.
Sure, yeah, something for you guys to discuss. I did just want to point that out, that I think that's relevant. A couple of miscellaneous items, and then we're really close to being through the slides. I know this is a really long one. Sure,
You skipped over one that I think is quite important, and that's waste management.
I didn't. I just was trying to
Okay.
see how close I was to the
When you
end of
get
the
to that,
presentation.
Got a couple of comments.
Trust me, I am very aware of how much we have to get through. So no roof appurtenances, which is roof mounted equipment, are proposed. That's a question that comes up pretty often. They're proposing pad mounted utilities instead. These do have to be screened for requirements in the zone, so they'll need to show that during permit. I added a condition of approval, or we added a condition of approval to reiterate that for the record. A little bit about snow removal. So it's a private site. City doesn't obviously plow like parking lots for private developments. That would be handled privately. Snow storage for, I believe, a foot of snow is required, foot across the entire paved area. They're showing that just north of those 4 surface stalls, we recommended a condition of approval that those stalls can't be used for snow storage. You know, snow can't block those stalls. Needs to be contained to the actual snow storage shed.
So just north, I'm looking at that, that's maybe 6 feet by 16 feet
Yep, that was found to be sufficient by our engineering department, but they'll check it again during technical review.
for on site.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, and then we get to waste management. So this is another really big topic in the public comments, as I know you guys saw, so I think that'll come up in your discussion. They're proposing to do individual trash cans instead of a site dumpster. So sometimes we see the site dumpsters instead. Our code has regulations for those dumpsters, how close they can be to property lines, et cetera. Our code doesn't say specifics for the individual trash cans. But they're proposing that those would go for curbside pickup on Bengal Boulevard on trash day. Again, I think there was a pretty common theme brought up of concern in public comment about that and the impact. So I think that'll come up in your discussion, but that's what they're proposing.
Here's my problem with that. You have the frontage,
Sure,
okay? And so you've really got 34 feet on one side and you've got 44 feet on the other. That's taking out a 25-foot little swath that you have for Cottonwood Heights, and the 26 feet, if I recall correctly, the width of the driveway or the common area. That being the case, you've got 20 cans to get rid of. Because as you drive up and down the streets, everybody has a black can and a blue can.
right. Sometimes the glass
So that's
can-
2 cans and that's 20 cans. The cans are, I measured mine, they're 31 inches across.
Sure,
Okay, and if you call Wasatch Waste Management,
Right.
they require, or would like to require 3 feet between each can
right.
because the arms for access to the cans. That being the case, here's the figures. Where did I get to? If you can only then have, well, here we go. You can only have 6 cans then on the 34-inch side, that's the west side. And on the 44 sides, that's 8 cans. That's
Sure.
14 cans, that's 6 cans short of what's going to be supplied on a weekly basis, and that's with considering 3 feet between the cans. If you put all 20 cans out there in those same spaces, the distance between the cans is just a little under 1.5 feet.
Sure,
So that isn't, and the deal is with Wasatch waste removal is that if it's under 3 feet, it's the driver's discretion whether or not they'll pick up the cans.
Hmm,
So you run the possibility if you've got them all out there, with
Sure.
a foot and a half between them, none of them get picked up. Besides, it's kind of an unsightly mess. So, what it boils down to is that not everybody's going to be able to put out 2 cans, or they're not going to work well with Wasatch waste removal. And
yeah,
that being the case, then it makes it, I think, a good case to have a central waste receptacle for all of them to put their trash in, because putting it on the front curb really doesn't work. That being the case, where are you going to put it? The only place you can put it is where they've got 4 stalls that we've just been talking about that are inadequate, and you have to have room to back out, so that where you put that on the property at the end of that driveway, so it can be pushed or picked up by a trash truck that can
Yeah.
handle all of that. You've taken away really the visitor parking.
I think that's a great question for the applicant to solve. So we can ask them how they would plan to do that. Again, this is just kind of what they're proposing. That's what we're covering in this presentation. What does our code say about it? And I think that's a great question to pose to them and say, how are you?
Well, I
gonna
don't know
solve
that
it?
that's
I
in
think it's
code. That's
very
this is just
reasonable
how it
to
goes.
ask. That is a perceived impact.
Yeah, I
that's
think that's a
valid.
reasonable thing to hit
So I
on.
think what you could ask
Well,
is
it's a huge
is
impact.
for the applicant to propose an internal trash management system.
Yeah.
And come back to you and demonstrate how that operates and how that functions in the context of what they've proposed. Or if it impacts their site layout or development, then they should come back and demonstrate that.
Yeah, that's a great thing to hit on. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the benefit of the projects coming to these meetings. is
Well,
that
the way they've got
there's
it,
discourse.
the way they've got it specified now, it's not gonna work.
I think
Just short
There-
and sweet.
it's great
Again,
to
some-
call that out.
Some experience, some anecdotal experience. The Canyon Center development has the single family homes component of it. There's 17 of them there. They place cans out on the Canyon Center Parkway. They show up there and there's 34 plus cans on trash pickup day. But what the council did at the time, which isn't an option anymore, was they created a permit parking designation along the frontage of that property, so that they do have room to put their cans out on trash pickup day. That permit parking isn't an option in our code anymore, so they would need to mitigate this concern some other way.
I'm sure I think the public will appreciate you bringing it up. I think that was a really common concern. And it's conditional uses are hard because state code regulates them to a point where it can't be like everything anyone wants gets stipulated, but it can be and is meant to be a process where reasonable conditions are put in place. So I know we have just a couple minutes left. I think we're really close here. I just wanted to note that, and also for the public, for anyone who submitted a public comment, we got your public comments. Any that were sent by 12 p.m. yesterday on Tuesday were given to the commission in advance of the meeting. And then it's also scheduled for public hearing at tonight's business session, starting in just a few minutes. So I hope that we'll have additional public comment. We've got a great opportunity to do that tonight. You guys know our recommended conditions of approval that we put in here. You've talked a lot about other possible conditions, so I won't go through all these right here, but those are there. And then I have 3 model motions. One would be for approval, one would be for continuation, and one would be for denial. So those are at your disposal for when the time comes. And that is the end of my slides. So thanks for letting me get through them all. I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Sam. In the next 4 minutes, do we have some other questions we want to pose to staff? Or do we want to table and finish up our deliberations in the business?
I just have a quick question about the height of the
sure.
buildings. I guess that's set already in the code somewhere,
Yeah.
but that was one of the common concerns that were expressed by the neighbors of that development.
Yeah.
Of course.
Is that something that is negotiable, or is that if they're less than the 35 feet, you can't really stop that?
Where they're 5 feet under, we don't view that as an extenuating impact of this development as opposed to any other development, basically any property in the city. Any of those homes could build a home today at 35 feet. And be permitted, not have to go through any public process, just get a building permit. So unless you can tie it to a potential impact there, probably not view related, that's not something we regulate via ordinance, then you could seek that, but height alone is 5 feet under the maximum, and we allow homes and buildings elsewhere in every other zone to be built at 35 feet today.
So one other question I had that in the few minutes we have left, and if we want to continue with this. What else could be built
Oh, like
with
in
this, for this zone?
the neighborhood commercial zone?
Yeah, like, could it be it could be a commercial shopping
Yeah,
area,
we can talk
correct?
about other things. I mean, it's always like if somebody picks one off that list that's allowed, you can't make them choose a different use, but Mike has the list pulled
Yeah.
up.
I can just share.
I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks.
Every use in the neighborhood commercial zone is conditional. There's no outright allowed uses, so that's kind of interesting. A lot of conditional uses that come to the commission are in the neighborhood commercial zone, so. Here's the list. It always lags a little bit, but we've got mixed residential housing, bed and breakfast, commercial recreation, a reception center, convenience store, grocery store with some specifications. Convenience store, fast food, medical, optical, dental clinics with some specifications, administrative, general, professional specs, studios for artist, designer, writer, restaurant, retail, commercial, church, home occupation. Oh, I'm getting dizzy. Home preschools, child daycare, preschool, parks, playgrounds, community rec, plan unit developments, which is also housing, public and private utility, residential facilities for elderly persons, child or adult daycare facilities, schools, live workspaces. That's the one we're looking at, W. Class D private clubs, which is a bar, and retail, small commercial. So pretty long list.
Question on that. So plan unit development and live workspaces are different sections here.
Yeah.
Could they not just apply for a plan unit development without the live work component?
I believe the PUD has an acreage requirement that this site does not meet.
Yeah, it would be
It's
three.
a 3 acre minimum,
Uh,
but if it were 3 acres, it could be 100% residential use.
Okay. So going back to that, because there's two separate things there, I think there's a lot of intention with there being 3 acres for a plan unit development. We're looking for a plan unit development. So what does the process look like for us to ensure that there's compliance on the live work component? Is deed restriction the best way to do so, or are there other kind of administrative processes? Because I think that we want to promote compliance here, and I think live work really fits neighborhood commercial. I just don't want to have, there's a reason that a planned unit development requires 3 acres.
Sure.
Where it's a nice niche live work opportunity for our city.
Just some thoughts, just offhand. Deed restriction is one way. I don't know the impacts on the private side and financing and how that impacts all that, but it's not our problem to figure out.
Right.
Mandating that a license be maintained and on file with the city and renewed annually could be another way. How much that license is operating could be debated, but you could mandate that a license be on file and active with the city. A commercial license,
For the work component
for the
of
work
the live.
component, yeah. The Walsh property PDD project is very different than this. They have live work units. They are required to maintain licenses on those units. So again, we've done that.
I'm just gonna pop across in case there's anyone waiting in the other room, so whenever you're ready.
The other thing we've done on the Fort Union projects is we require that those buildings have street fronting entrances and space for wall signage, and that they be allowed commercial signage standards to ensure or provide the flexibility for work. But that's up to you on what direction you want.
Great. Yeah, I think just looking at this, I think that's an important component within neighborhood commercial. Not just promoting multifamily for the sake of multifamily, we've got an ordinance for PUD to be able to promote that, which has a requirement, 3 acres. I think promoting something that is going to evoke that commercial component, I think is pretty important in my mind.
Right, I agree. I agree.
And I would-
Okay, yeah.
I would just end with part of the purpose statement of the neighborhood commercial. Obviously, it's a broad zone. The Smith Shopping Center across the street is neighborhood commercial. This property is very different context, obviously, but part of the purpose of NC is to encourage residential mixed use to further enhance the transition between neighborhood commercial and adjacent residential uses. This is a subjective standard, but I do feel like this kind of mid-density type of product that's a mix of residential and commercial does serve that purpose, and staff could argue that it does meet that part of the purpose of the zone.
And I would agree. I'd love the idea of this, but man, it just feels like we're squeezing.
Sure.
And there's a part of me, it's like, what if it was 6? What if it was 8? I think that would mitigate so many challenges that we're talking about, because most of the issues we're talking about our ground floor, not total square footage. I know the height, there's some discussion there, but I feel like we just listed off like 10 pretty significant problems related to
Yeah.
ground floor stuff.
Yeah,
So
and-
I'm anxious to hear what the applicant has to say.
I think activating that ground floor is going to allow for that transition into the community, into the residential zones in a beautiful way. So I think that, once again, I love neighborhood commercial and I love these types of developments. However, there's a lot of non-compliance opportunity if they're not handled appropriately at this level. And I think that's where we need to be pretty firm.
Each of these units is how many square feet, the work? units?
They're.
Hundred.
Or the 100
100 and
About
Say
8
100
by
That's wise.
12-ish, yeah. Have like 10 by
It's
10.
really,
It was 9 by
Really
12,
not
as I recall.
It's a bedroom.
it's 100.
Okay, let's wrap up.
Make a motion that we adjourn.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor?